Chapter 6, The Montauk Mistrial. After learning about the Montauks losing the rights to their property, my next step was to go to the East Hampton Library and investigate the court case. I was escorted by a friend who is familiar with the library and took me to a special room. One does not check out the materials, nor does one even retrieve the books or papers themselves. The reference desired is selected from the card catalog, and the librarian gives you the book or papers. I recognize the particular librarian's name who helped me. It was given to me a year earlier by Dick White, the president of the Montauk Historical Society. He told me that this particular librarian had been involved in archaeological digs concerning the Montauks, but that she was very close-mouthed on the subject. I didn't tell her any of this, but I did show her the picture of the pyramids and asked if she had ever heard of them. She just laughed and said they looked like sand dunes. She apparently had no relevant information to share, but there seemed to be a definite attitude on her part. I didn't press the point. I then told her I was interested in the Montauk Indian court case. The librarian quickly produced a very large volume of the entire trial. It was very old. She put it on the desk and told me I could read it all about it. I perceived what I thought to be some subtle disgust in her voice. It was not directed at me, but at the entire mess. I began to study the court case and learned a lot about the history of the Montauk. On October 13th and 14th, 1909, a special term of Supreme Court was held in Suffolk County, New York. The plaintiffs were the Montauk tribe of Indians as represented by their chief, Maria Pharaoh, a descendant of the chief Wyandanch referred to earlier. The defendants were as follows: Jan Ann Benson and Mary Benson as executresses of the last will and testament of Arthur W. Benson, John J. Pierpont, and Henry R. Hoyt as executors and trustees of the last will and testament of Frank Sherman Benson, Mary Benson, the Montauk Company, Montauk Dock and Improvement Company, Alfred W. Hoyt, the Montauk Extension Railroad Company, and the Long Island Railroad Company. No one seemed to dispute that on August 6, 1660, the Indians sold the Montauk land to the townspeople of East Hampton. The Indians received a counter bond at the time to occupy said land. To avoid any confusion, on February 6, 1661, another deed was made expressly to secure the Indians' rights to occupy said land. Note that each date possessed 3 sixes. It must be stated and emphasized that in all of the agreements with the Indians and the white people, there was a solemn agreement on the part of the white people to forever protect the right of the Indians to occupy the land as long as they wished. The reason for this is intensely spiritual, as Native Americans do not view property ownership the way the white race does. To them, the land belongs to the Great Spirit or God and cannot be owned by any one man. One can only act as a custodian. This great divergence resulted in confusion and negative feelings when Lion Gardner acquired Montauk land from Chief Wyandanch. When Wyandanch wanted to reoccupy the land, it seems that Lion Gardner conveniently forgot the arrangement. The term Indian giver arose from this dispute and has permeated the culture ever since. The lawyers for both sides were well aware of how the Montauks felt about the land. The principal points of the Indians were stated as follows: that their rights of occupancy had never been extinguished and that the deeds to the Bensons under which the defendants' claims are invalid. A, because they were obtained in violation of the laws of this state. B, they were obtained by the false representations that their ancient rights in Montauk would forever be preserved intact, notwithstanding the deeds. Much of the actual dispute centered around what happened when the property was sold to Benson. 2 centuries after the townspeople of East Hampton had acquired the Montauk land, their heirs liquidated and sold it to Benson. The Montauk's rights to their land was specifically mentioned in the deed, and they held regular meetings on the sacred ground in accordance with their ancient rights. In actual fact, many of the Montauks continued to live in what were known as the Indian Fields. After he acquired the property, Benson systematically went around to the Montauks and enticed them off the land by giving them homes in East Hampton or elsewhere. He claimed that the right of the Montauks to the land was only a temporary arrangement. It was only a matter of time before the Montauks were scattered. Only after this point did rumors begin to circulate about the Montauks being a disbanded tribe. It wasn't really true, and in fact, no one ever contested the existence of the Montauk tribe prior to Benson's purchase. One can also see the potential for manipulation when you look at the different companies named as defendants. After the initial court dates, no decision was rendered. A dispute arose between the Montauks and their own attorney. He was concerned about payment and abandoned the case. It is not hard to imagine that the lawyer was paid off by a vested interest, but no mention of this was made. After all, this was an official record I was reading. On November 1st, 1910, the court reconvened. This time, the Montauks were represented by a new lawyer. A decision was rendered against them. On December 9th, 1910, the headlines of the East Hampton Star read, "Montauk Tribe Legally Dead." Notice they said legally. During the case, the defense had focused on what they called the Negroid appearance of some of the Montauks. They did not address the deeds, documents, and merits of the actual case. There was even a report that a missing packet of crucial information wasn't considered at all by the court. Somehow, the defense convinced the judge that the Montauks were extinct as a result of intermarriage with blacks. The judge's name was Abel Blackmar, which is rather amusing if you consider the proposition that people dramatize their own name. In such an instance, he would dramatize being able to mar black. The case was a civil rights nightmare. The East Hampton Star article even stated the Indians had a valid constitutional point on their side. But the newspaper said appeal was doubtful because other cases had resulted in land going to the owners. In my opinion, this is an extremely apathetic response. The owners are the owners, and that's just the way it is. Wanting to find out what had happened to the case, I contacted Olivia Pharaoh. She is the oldest of the Pharaoh clan and lives on the east end of Long Island. A very nice woman. Olive was glad to hear I was interested in the case. She told me a story that the court claimed that the Montauks were declared extinct because no one showed up on their behalf. This was definitely not true. According to that particular account, the judge said something to the effect that, well, there are no Montauk Indians here. The case is dismissed. There were plenty of Montauks present at the court, but they were just ignored. Olive further informed me that the case was never appealed due to lack of money. I told Ken Arthur what I'd found out about the Montauks. He told me there had been a systematic attempt to degrade them and their heritage by forcing them to intermarry with blacks. This was done through economic deprivation and manipulation rather than by supervised intercourse. The design was for them to become the lowest of the low. Given the racial attitude of the country at that time, it is not surprising that blacks were viewed that way. What is more surprising is that someone wanted the Montauks out of the way. After learning much of the information, Preston and I visited Joe Pitone. Joe is mentioned in Montauk Revisited as the owner of the E.T. Company and was thought by Preston and myself to be involved up to his eyebrows in the Montauk Project. We updated ourselves with Joe and told him how Montauk related to Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons. He was very well aware of who they were and conceded that we were into some heavy stuff, as he put it. At one point, Joe began to talk about his home in Sedona, Arizona. We weren't aware that he had a home there, but I chided him. "You're not supposed to live in Sedona," I said. "It's sacred Indian ground, and you're only allowed to visit." For those of you who are not familiar with the Native American traditions concerning Sedona, this is a true statement. I was primarily teasing Joe, but getting a point across at the same time. My curiosity was piqued. Joe is in his 70s and is definitely not a New Ager, as are many of the people who have moved to Sedona. Why would a military contractor who seems to spend most of his time in New York have a home in Sedona? We then told Joe about the court case in Montauk being on sacred Native American soil. Much to our surprise, he knew the Montauk Indian case backwards and forward. His knowledge is very far-reaching in general, but this seemed to be too much of a coincidence to be taken lightly. He told us that the Montauk Indians were extinct and that they could never win a court case for that very reason. There weren't any left. At least the court wouldn't recognize them due to the black blood factor. It then occurred to us that Joe might have some answers about who actually owned Camp Hero. He obviously wasn't gung-ho about conceding ownership to the Montauk. Joe said that Camp Hero is federal property. We mentioned that the tax map said it was New York state property. He told us that the state were only custodians and held it in guardianship for the feds. This is not the first time we had heard that the feds still owned Camp Hero. It is one more example of the confusion concerning the rightful ownership of the Montauk base. Many months later, Preston would hear from a friend who knew a current female member of the Montauk tribe. This woman told a story of a systematic effort by industry to deny work to any descendants of the Montauk. There was nothing personal in the decision. The idea was simply to strangle them economically so as to force them to join the military. The strategy was to force the Montauks to fill out an application for the armed services. There, they would have to sign up as blacks, as there was no administrative way to include them as Native Americans. This would document that the people were actually blacks and not Montauks at all. This is just one more story of an attempt to deny the Montauks their native heritage. It has obviously occurred throughout the history of the property dispute. That it would be occurring today should not be surprising. There is also another point to consider. On April 7th, 1918, the Montauks were made white men by court ruling. The Montauks have not only been declared non-existent, but someone seems to find it necessary to drive home the point again and again. The only apparent reason for this type of behavior is that someone considers the Montauks to be a threat. Never before had I ever heard of a court or anyone else going to such official lengths to declare a tribe of native people extinct. Namaste. Namaskaram.